Welcome to The Writer's Dream, where authors talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. Please find us on YouTube and Facebook. If you have a question for us or you'd like to be on the show, please message us through Facebook. Today we have three authors, Robert Mladinich, Philip Messing, and Bernard Whalen, who have written a very interesting book about the undisclosed files of the police, cases from the archives of the NYPD. Our host today is Jack Bolello, and we expect to have some very interesting memories and stories about the police files.
Good morning, and you are in for a treat. I have read this book, and it was a fascinating read, and I cannot recommend it too highly. I'd like to introduce the authors of the book, Bernie Whalen, Philip Messing, and Robert Mladinich. Now, can you tell us a little about your background and so on, how you even got into police work and so on?
Sure. I'm Bernie Whalen. I joined the New York City Police Department in 1981. One of the things I always wanted to do also was to be a writer, and I was able to actually combine those careers with a couple other books also. And the most recent one before this, NYPD's First 50 Years, was what led into Undisclosed Files of the Police.
My name is Phil Messing, and I am a veteran journalist in New York City. I've been writing about law enforcement for more than 35 years. I recently left the New York Post, but I've been writing about cops and robbers for a long time.
Bob?
I'm Bob Mladinich. I served the New York City Police Department from 1983 to 2003. Prior to that, I attended college where I earned a bachelor's degree in journalism, so that was always an interest of mine. This is my fourth book that I've either written or collaborated on. One of the books was about my college friendship with a fellow student by the name of Joel Rifkin, who became New York's most prolific serial killer and with whom I attended college in the 1970s.
He lived in East Meadow, I believe.
He lived in East Meadow, and I'm originally from Huntington, so we had a lot in common.
Okay.
Small world.
Fascinating, fascinating. You know, one of the great features of this book, in addition to fascinating stories of police files going back to 1831 to 2010, are the photographs. They are absolutely riveting. Right on the front is a photograph of Abe Kid Twist Relis, who was a member of Murder Incorporated, the contract killers for some of the biggest mafia gangs in New York City. And Kid Twist Relis, I remember I was telling the gentleman that as a young man, my father would take me to Coney Island and always point to the Half Moon Hotel as we passed and say, that's where Abe Relis flew out the window. And the title of that particular chapter is The Canary Who Could Sing But Could Not Fly. Can you tell us a little bit about the Kid Twist?
Yeah, Kid Twist was a very prolific hitman. He was known for using an ice pick to stab his nemesis in the temple, and very often he was able to fool a lot of the coroners who thought that these people died of brain hemorrhages, not of being stabbed. He was also one of the first mob turncoats in mafia history. He was being held under very heavy police guard in order to testify against Albert Anastasia, which was unprecedented for the time. And unfortunately, the night before he was going to testify, he either fell or was pushed or jumped out of the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel. And it's still a source of controversy to this day.
And following that up, in the book, you will see the photographs of Albert Anastasia when he finally met his comeuppances, I believe in 1957.
Right.
Yes.
Run down at a barbershop at the Sheraton Hotel or something, and a fascinating story about his background and time. His brother was the head of the docks, I believe, Tony Anastasia, and I think he had a brother who was a priest.
Yeah, Phil is the Anastasia expert.
Yes.
He wrote that
Can you
story.
tell us a little bit about that?
You know, it's funny. I did this story. I believe it was in 2007. I did the story for the paper, and I went up to the hotel just to do a 50th anniversary story on the assassination in the barbershop because, you know, there was a lot of jokes, as there often is, and morbid occasions give rise to morbid jokes, and after he got killed, they said that there was a barbershop quartet that had killed him. And I went up there just hoping to see what kind of retrospective I could do 50 years later, and I started asking questions, and most of the people weren't happy to see me there, but I asked enough questions. I found a guy who was in his early 80s who was there as a waiter. He was a waiter in 2007, and he was a waiter in 1957, and he had heard the gunshots. And he said, I told all the cops I didn't speak English. He had a Italian accent, and he was joking about how he kind of just wanted to remain mum about what had occurred that day.
Yeah, that's great. Albert, of course, was a notorious gangster. His brother, Tough Tony, was also involved with the rackets. And there was a brother who was a priest. I guess you could say he was the black sheep in that particular family, right?
There's
So, right. And then
There's about a dozen people that showed up at his funeral.
yeah.
That was it.
very small.
And I think he's buried at the Greenwood Cemetery
Correct.
in Brooklyn, which is a fascinating place.
Right, a lot of people.
You could go there. Teddy Roosevelt, who a lot of people, of course, will know him as our 26th president and the Trust Buster and San Juan Hill and the Rough Riders, but not too many people may realize that he was what at that point in time would be called the police commissioner of the NYPD, although I don't believe it was called the commissioner at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about the Teddy Roosevelt? And I just have a fascinating picture here, a photo of Teddy when he was the police commissioner, although, as I said...
He was actually the president of the police board, which was a four-man board that ran the police department back then in 1895 and 96. He had been brought in specifically to reform the police department, which after the Lexow hearings had determined or confirmed what a lot of people believed, that there was a lot of corruption in the police department. His job was to clean it up. And he wasn't very popular, believe it or not, with the men because he took a hard line on corruption. But he also attempted to modernize the police department. He brought in the Bertillon method to identify criminals. He was a proponent of using science, and he only lasted 2 years, and before he went on to bigger and better things. But he certainly is memorable. The desk that's in that picture is actually still used by police commissioners today.
That's a fascinating story in itself. You know, my father, I remember as a child, would always talk, being an Italian American and growing up in the East New York section of Brooklyn, would always talk about one of the first Italian Americans in the police department, a gentleman by the name of Joseph Petrosino. Can you tell us a little bit about that fascinating story? Because my father used to tell me about it quite often.
Well, I mean, my recollection of it, I didn't do that chapter, but the Petrosino was basically brought in because the Black Hand was a bunch of extortionists from Italy, and they were preying on the Italian immigrants that lived in the city. And at that time, they decided to send him to Italy to kind of find out why a lot of these people were coming over. And in the course of investigating it on the Italian side, the people from that group had identified him as an NYPD police official, and he was assassinated in Italy. Sicily, was it? Sicily.
Yeah, Sicily.
Palermo.
Palermo. Unfortunately, he was supposed to be on a secret mission, but the police commissioner at that time was a guy, Theodore Bingham, and he was kind of a blabbermouth of sorts. He liked to toot his own horn, and when the press was looking for Petrosino, because he was in the papers every day, all of a sudden he's not around, and they interview Bingham, and they say, hey, where's Petrosino? And he says, for all I know, he's on a secret mission. Well, as soon as the mob heard that, they dispatched their hitmen to Italy, located him, and killed him.
And that was like 1906,
Yeah,
something of that kind.
Yeah, around 1908.
Yeah, something
yes.
at that point. You know, it seems like every week there's a trial of the century. I mean, you heard about O.J., the trial of the century, but the first time I think it was called the trial of the century goes way back to around this period, 1906, with the murder of Stanford White, who was a world-renowned architect, and he's the guy who developed the original Madison Square Garden. Can you tell us a little bit about that trial of the century involving Stanford White and Evelyn Nesbit, who was a famous personality, actress, and so on?
Bernie is an expert on that area, and he's an expert on that story. He wrote that chapter.
Story. Nesbitt was a very beautiful young girl, a lot of suitors, including Stanford White, who was a much older man. Probably today, what that romance wouldn't be, might be even considered a crime, what happened. But she had another suitor, Harry Thaw. He was from Pittsburgh, had a lot of money. He wooed her, and he was very jealous of her prior relationship with Stanford White, and it drove him to the point where he decided he had to kill the guy. And sure enough, they're in Madison Square Garden, up on the rooftop back then. They used to do summer shows because it was so hot. And there was a review, and Stanford White was there, and Thaw was there with his wife, and he went and put a bullet right in his head, right in front of everybody. He got off insanity. Never, with his money, he sat in jail, was enjoying steaks from Delmonico's.
I have a picture of that.
In the book, and he then eventually he does get out. Tell you how security was so lax then. He escaped. Was out for 2 years. They caught him up in Canada. They brought him back. Psychiatrists finally got him off. And the woman that he did all this for, he divorced and left her penniless. She said, you know, Stanford White was the lucky one. He died. Staying with this guy, Thaw ruined her life.
The initial assessment was that Stanford White that had attacked her when she was about, because this all happened when she's about 18. And
16.
16.
That's what.
Yeah.
Well, he wooed her
was
romance, and she didn't know any
married.
better. Harry Thaw actually raped her.
Yes.
Too. So it was a lot of bad things going on. A very convoluted love triangle. A lot of.
Which we still see today. You'll
Yeah, it's
notice
no
a lot of these stories from 60, 70, even 100 years ago, or especially with bombings, are very similar to things we see today,
The more things change, the more they remain
Exactly.
the same, is an old
Exactly.
expression.
without
Yeah,
question.
one of the great pictures in I believe in 1920, which at that point, up until I think the World Trade Center, was one of the biggest terrorist attacks, was the bombing of the Wall Street, the J.P. Morgan building. You have a beautiful picture of the pockmark still in there to this day. You can go down there and see it. Many of the crimes, and as I said, as a student of history, I was chairman of the history department at Lindenhurst Public Schools. Many of the crimes are politically motivated and socially motivated. For example, you have a beautiful chapter in here on the draft riots of during the American Civil War in 1863. One of the things that I found fascinating, the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the biggest battle of the Civil War, 51,000 casualties in 3 days. Many of the survivors of that crucial, horrible, horrific battle came to quell the riots in New York City just a couple weeks later, I think middle of July, and some of them who survived Gettysburg were killed in New York City trying to. Can you tell us a little about what prompted those riots, the draft riots?
Well, the draft riots in New York had a lot to do with the social caste system. And the Irish felt like they were, this is just one facet, there's a lot of other facets, but a lot of the newly arrived Irish were being drafted into the Union Army. And they did not feel as if they deserved to be drafted into the army to fight for this cause.
People who had money were able
Right.
to avoid the draft.
Yeah, a common expression was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight.
Exactly.
And
that's something obviously we saw 100 years hence with the Vietnam War as well.
And they had that whole scene was depicted in Gangs of New York by Martin
Yes, and that's
Scorsese.
been on cable even as we speak.
Yes.
You can see it almost every day. There's a beautiful
there.
depiction of the draft riots. I think to this day it's having more casualties, killings, than any other riot in New York City history, right? Is that,
Yes.
It was very, very brutal. They were going up and down, Lower Manhattan, and they were just lynching people in the streets.
And many African Americans
Right.
too. They burned a black orphanage
right.
with the children in it.
Right.
And so it was just a horrible,
It
horrible
was
period
really
of
a
time.
pitched battle for the police, and thankfully, the soldiers came to help them because they were overwhelmed.
Yeah.
People often talk about the good old days and how peaceful New York used to be, and you would sleep on the fire escape, and you would leave your windows open, and a mother would just whistle, and everybody would come home for dinner. This book will do a little bit of a disservice to that thought process.
Yeah, I think
because there
that's
was
very
plenty
important.
of crime back
Yeah,
then.
that's very important too, because there is that tendency to think today is the worst of all possible
Right.
times, and we don't realize that things were as bad, maybe even worse in
some ways.
And a lot of the hatreds and the prejudices were ethnically driven, as they are today.
Exactly.
Yeah, only from instead of the Irish and the Italians.
Exactly.
Now it's other ethnic groups that have come in lately. There's a fascinating. Again, everything is fascinating. I use this word fascinating. You know why? Because it is fascinating. The Nazis in New York chapter.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize that prior to our entrance into World War II, there was a big Nazi movement. Can you talk a little bit about the Nazis in New York chapter?
Sure. There was the German-American Bund. Right? People don't really realize that Germans were the most populous immigrant group in the country. So it was natural that when they saw what was going on overseas, and we're in a state of depression here, that they were drawn to that type of leadership, if you want to call it that. And they actually formed units with marching and uniforms and really mimicked what was going on.
Like a Bund.
And yes, the Bund in Nazi Germany. In fact, right not far from here in Yaphank was a Camp Siegfried where they marched around in their military uniforms, really right up to the start of the war. And then there was a real shift. Once the war actually came, those groups, the FBI and the police, put them down. But the people themselves in those groups said, hey, this is not for us. And they ended up, fighting for America. Although before that, you wouldn't have known it because there were a rally in Madison Square Garden with 30,000 marching around. And a terrific picture in the book.
Terrific picture.
They had streets named for the Nazi leadership in the.
Out in the Yaphank. So, there's a lot of forgotten history that we bring about, talk about. It's really fascinating.
The community that I worked in, Lindenhurst, was a German community. Its name was Breslau. The original name of Lindenhurst when the community started up until this period of time when it was changed from Breslau to Lindenhurst precisely because there was such a strong German Bund movement and German community. And and the other one, the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. That's another, exciting, remarkable chapter. Can you tell us a little bit about that period?
Bob was the expert. Bob.
Yeah, that case has always fascinated me, even long before this opportunity came to write about it. But Julius and Ethel Rosenberg and their family members, they were in the Army, or Julius was in the Army during World War II. He was a graduate of City College. He had an engineering degree, and he was given secrets to the Soviets. That was really never in question. What was in question was his wife's involvement, and his wife refused to testify against her husband, and what she was accused of doing on the basis of the testimony of her brother alone, David Greenglass, who was also involved with the Soviets, was that she would type up all of the reports that were given to the Soviet handlers. It later came out, and David Greenglass admitted decades later that he lied and sent his sister to the electric chair, and he lied to protect his wife, and he made no apologies for that whatsoever. And that is still in the news. Sam Roberts of the New York Times covers this story to this day.
And their sons, whose name now is Leopold, have been spending for the last 60-some-odd years trying to vindicate the name of their parents. Right. And there's a very interesting picture of the two boys when they were 7, 9 at that period of time, and they're wearing Brooklyn Dodger baseball hats, and that's what I have here today. I was an old Brooklyn Dodger fan.
One thing you're going to see in this book throughout the 50s, there's a whole undercurrent of communism throughout.
Right.
For example, Martin Luther King was stabbed in 1958 by an African-American woman while he was doing a book signing in Harlem. And the woman was deranged. She spent about 18 years in a mental hospital. But the reason the reason given to the police for her stabbing Martin Luther King was because she thought he was a communist. Mm-hmm. So there really was a genuine fear of communism that a lot of young people.
The Red Scare. The Red Scare. And here is the picture of the Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. You can see it's absolutely jammed. So that gives you an idea of the extent of the support that existed in this country prior to World War II. And it's another fascinating picture. The Rosenbergs are buried right here on Wellwood. There were a couple Jewish cemeteries on Wellwood Avenue, the Mount Ararat and Mount the Fiore, and they're all Jewish cemeteries, and they're buried right here. And I used to take my students on a quick field trip to see the graves of the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg when I had to deal with that particular aspect of history. Now let's get to Malcolm X. You mentioned the stabbing of Martin Luther King, but also the fascinating story of Malcolm X and his assassination, I think in about 1965 or so.
Yeah.
And we talk a little bit about Malcolm X.
Malcolm X was another African-American leader that believed in black unity by any means necessary. And those three words is what terrified mainstream America. If you remember Muhammad Ali, who became a beloved figure, but when he first joined the Muslim Party and was involved with Malcolm X, he was detested and feared by the American mainstream. As it turns out, Malcolm X renounced a lot of the original principles and wound up being assassinated. By today's standards, he would have been considered a peace bearer, not a man of violence.
Yeah, and here is another full-page photo of Malcolm X and that slogan, by any means necessary, which scared a lot of people
Absolutely.
in the 1960 period and so on. And and then you have a very, talking about a social, today again, you just mentioned, Bob, that by today's standards, he would be a peacemaker, and Lenny Bruce comes to mind. His problems and difficulties that he had with censorship. And some people say he was murdered by society. Can you talk a little bit about Lenny Bruce?
Lenny Bruce basically went to jail and was convicted of a crime for using dirty words and for political satire, which today we see on television all the time. But as hard as it is to believe, even in Greenwich Village in the mid-1960s, Greenwich Village is considered the liberal bastion of the country. He was arrested for using curse words.
Yeah, and here he is, a full page of a comedian, a social critic, a social comedian who was hounded and pounded because of his use of language, which today you see in any movie. Anybody can go see these movies with the same kind of language and themes.
And there's one little footnote to that story that I thought was always amusing, Bob, about how he was defended by Bobby Cochran.
He was
Johnny
charged.
Cochran.
He was charged in Los Angeles with the exact same crimes he was charged with here, and his prosecutor in Los Angeles was a very young Johnny Cochran. 3 decades before he defended O.J. Simpson. And by the way, Cochran lost that case, so he wasn't always
always successful.
he wasn't always in the winner's circle.
And then, of course, we have the group that scared the heck out of so many Americans and became the Black Panther movement of that period. Can you talk a little bit about the Black Panthers and the leaders like Elwood Cleaver and who else?
Well, I mean, it was a movement that started in California. It was in Chicago. It was in New York, and there was I think 21 of them that went to trial for riots or an assortment of crimes, and it was, I think, the longest trial in New York City history. It went on for 18 months, something like that, and they were eventually all acquitted. And that was just a very, very unusual period in our country, because there was a series of different events involving different groups that were all expressing anger. Basically, you had them. You had the FALN group that was advocating, Puerto Rican independence, that waged a campaign of bombing throughout the country. You had the Weather Underground that was involved at, in various things, and it was just rather amazing, because it seemed that the entire youth movement was caught up in this fringe element of violence.
Which gets back to your point, Bob, that things
don't
were
change.
as bad as, if not worse in many cases, than things
We're seeing it
today.
today with Donald Trump, the revolution and all of the people taking it to the streets.
Yeah, and talk about the FLAN, they wanted Puerto Rican, I think.
Right,
independence,
correct.
And they bombed one of the great historic landmarks, Faunce's Tavern, where
Right.
George Washington met with his Continental Army, and gave a beautiful speech of thanking the troops. And That was bombed.
President
at that
Obama
very
just
time.
pardoned or commuted the sentence for,
Yeah, Oscar Lopez Rivera,
who
one of
was-
the founding fathers of that group.
of that group, and
It's a sort of many people that I know in the law enforcement community are very upset about that. I mean, there was 4 people that were murdered at Francis Tavern. They went there to have lunch, and next thing you know, one of a friend that I know, his father was one of the people that was killed. His name was Joe Connor, and his father, Frank Connor, was there, and he was expecting to come home on a, I think it was January of '76. So I think it's what is that? I can't do the math right now, but in any event, the bottom line on this anecdote is the fact that he was expecting to celebrate a belated 9th birthday. His older brother was 2 years older than him, was expecting to celebrate his 11th birthday, and the father never came home.
never came home. And the funny thing is, now there's a call for Puerto Rico to become a state. So the whole thing is flipped,
Yeah,
just flipped.
amazing.
For nothing.
amazing. And of course, we cannot allow this moment to go by without talking about the great political tragedies of the current year. The first bombing of the World Trade Center, and then, of course, September 11th. And that's some beautiful photographs, some frightening photographs, some terrifying, but absolutely compelling. Can you talk about the first and perhaps the second if we have time?
Bernie, why don't you handle it?
The main thing that I found most fascinating about the first is that a detective from the New York City Police Department bomb squad, Donald Sadawi, went down the crater and saw a differential from a vehicle that was just there, and he had been an automotive student in high school, and he realized that this was the epicenter of the bomb, and on his own, he got it out of there in a body bag against the FBI's wishes, and it turned out to be the piece of evidence that cracked the case because it belonged to the truck that had been rented in New Jersey.
Gentlemen, I know we only have about 30 seconds, and there was so much more that I wanted to talk about gangster crimes like Kid Dropper and Little Augie and Arnold Rothstein.
All terrific.
And Albert Anastasia, Paul Castellano and John Gotti.
Yeah, I wrote about
John
that.
Gotti was from my own neighborhood. He had the Fulton Rockaway boys. And the sociopaths, like the Mad Sculptor and the Mad Bomber and so on. And then there are some that defy description, like the Catholic priest who was executed for murder. The
that's gonna wrap it up.
the lieutenant.
Becker.
And that's it, folks. I'm sorry. We have so much more, but thank you so much for
It
a
went fast.
fascinating half hour. Went quickly.
Very fast half hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.